Welcome to the book of 1 Timothy. Now, there's just something about human nature, isn't there, that we just love to put things in groups. And the same is true with Paul's letters. I mean, we have the group of prison epistles, as we label them, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon. And then we have the group of pastoral epistles, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus. And as you can guess, the pastoral epistles are written from Paul to pastors. Titus was the pastor of the church on the island of Crete. Timothy pastored the church in Ephesus. And there's another unique element about the pastoral epistles. They just don't seem to fit in the timeline of the book of Acts. You try to figure out, okay, when did Paul write Timothy, 1 Timothy? Like, where does it belong in the book of Acts? And there's really nowhere where it slides in naturally. Therefore, this has led many scholars, most scholars, to believe that Paul wrote the pastoral epistles after his release from prison in Rome. That's the last thing that Luke records in the book of Acts, chapter 28. Paul is in prison in Rome, and scholars speculate that he was released from prison, and that's when some of this action took place, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. Well, let's try to reconstruct that a little bit with help from a map. So let's review, just so you remember some of the details of Paul's third missionary journey. He's going to run through here and return to Jerusalem, where he delivers the monetary gift from the Gentile churches to the churches in Judea, and then he's arrested in the temple, spends 2 years in prison in Caesarea, goes on a perilous sea voyage to Rome, and there is in house arrest in Rome for another 2 years. And though this isn't recorded in Acts, we know that he had to have testified before Caesar because God promised Paul that he would. So that takes place, we know. And based on some of the details in the pastorals and other places, we think Paul was released. He was released from prison. And he did expect that he would be released, by the way. Paul wrote Philippians from prison in Rome, and in that letter, there's a couple details where Paul says, I'm sure, I'm certain, I'm confident that I will be released. What happens next? What happens after Paul's, supposed release from prison in Rome? Well, you remember in Romans 15, Paul said that he wanted to go to Spain. That's possible. There's nothing necessarily in the text beyond Romans 15 that tells us that Paul went there. Church history seems to support that, or should I say, church history. So that's possible. We know, however, that he at some point found his way to the island of Crete, and there he commissions Titus to lead the church in Crete and appoint elders. We know also that Paul returned to Ephesus, and there he commissions Timothy to lead the church in Ephesus and to appoint elders. And then from Ephesus, Paul is going to go up into Macedonia. And that detail is demonstrated to us in the opening verses of 1 Timothy. Let's take a look. Verse 3, which I would argue is the most important verse in the entire book. It kind of sets up the trajectory of what this letter is going to deal with. Paul says that I urged you, Timothy, when I was going to Macedonia, I want you to stay in Ephesus so that you can charge certain people not to teach different doctrines. So we know that Paul was in Ephesus with Timothy, gave him some charges, and then went on to Macedonia. And we know also that Paul wanted to come back from Macedonia to Ephesus to help Timothy, because Timothy needed some help. There's some stuff going on in that city which needed the attention of an apostle. See this in chapter 3, verse 14. Paul says, man, I'm in Macedonia, but I hope to come to you soon. I'm writing these things to you so that if I delay, you would know what to do. But man, I want to come to you. I'm delayed. Here's some things for you to keep in mind before I return to Ephesus. So Paul is going to write the book of 1 Timothy to advise and to really authorize Timothy to confront the false teachers in that city. But I want to take a moment to talk about Timothy for a little bit, because he's the man. I mean, Timothy is a great guy. He has a really cool history, and I want to look at that. So let's look at a map here. Timothy is from Lystra. Right here, this is Paul's first missionary journey. That's the map we're looking at. And Timothy, his father was Greek and his mother was Jewish, and both his mother and grandmother taught him the scripture, so he was raised on the word. And it's possible that Paul met and converted Timothy on his first missionary journey. So we know that Paul cruised through Lystra on his first missionary journey. Timothy spent a lot of time in the synagogue. Paul went to the synagogue in Lystra. Maybe that's when Timothy was converted. We don't know. We do know that on Paul's second missionary journey, when he starts from Antioch and goes through Galatia, he's going to pick up Timothy here in Lystra. Timothy is going to join the team. He's going to be part of Paul's missionary team. And for the entirety of the second and most of the third missionary journey, Paul and Timothy are going to be doing ministry side by side. And it's what's neat is to see how much Paul entrusts to Timothy as his fellow worker. So, for example, when Paul and Timothy and Silas are cruising through Macedonia and they get to Berea, Paul, I'm going to zoom in a bit, Paul is going to go down to Athens, and he's going to go down by himself, and he's going to leave Timothy in Berea. You know what, Timothy? You got this. You know the scriptures. I want you to lead the church in Berea for a time. So Timothy does. And then Paul is going to go to Corinth, and in Corinth, Timothy's going to be reunited with Paul. And then from Corinth, Paul is going to tell Timothy, you know what? The church in Thessalonica, they were persecuted. They're in a rough spot. Why don't you, Timothy, go up to Thessalonica and see how they're doing? So Timothy says, yes, sir. And he goes off and he does that, which is awesome. Go, Timothy. And we see the same thing in Paul's third missionary journey, which is going to be conducted primarily out of Ephesus. Paul's going to be stationed in Ephesus, and he's going to send out his representatives to some of the churches that he founded from Ephesus, and Timothy's one of them. So Timothy is going to be sent into Macedonia. Check this out, Acts 19:22. Here we are. Paul's in Ephesus, and he says that having sent into Macedonia two of his helpers, Timothy and Erastus, he stayed in Asia. He stayed in Ephesus for a little while longer. So Paul is sending Timothy to Macedonia, and then the church in Corinth is just experiencing all kinds of problems. So Paul's like, all right, here's the letter of 1 Corinthians. Good luck, Timothy. Why don't you drop that off in that city and try to put into place some of the changes I've described in this little letter of mine. So Timothy faithfully goes and he does that. And then after Paul writes 2 Timothy, he's going to join, 2 Corinthians, Paul is going to join Timothy in Corinth. And then together they're going to go to Miletus, and they're going to Paul is going to give the speech to the Ephesian elders in that city, a very important speech. And then Paul is going to, of course, go back to Jerusalem and eventually be arrested, brought to Rome. And then while in Rome, Timothy's going to follow Paul to the capital of the empire and is going to minister to Paul's needs while Paul is in prison there. And from prison, Paul is going to send Timothy off again. You know, Timothy, he's like this little messenger guy. He's going to send Timothy this time to Philippi. We have that episode recorded in Philippians 2:19. Paul writes Philippians from prison in Rome, and he says, man, I hope to send Timothy to you because I got nobody like him. Timothy, he's amazing. He will be genuinely concerned for your welfare. Timothy, he's legit. And from Philippi, it's likely that Timothy went down to Ephesus, and then that is where Paul is going to join Timothy, and that brings us back to the situation and the purpose of this letter. We finally got there. I know that was a lot of time looking at maps, but I love just getting historically situated before I jump into the content of the letter. So this letter of First Timothy is operating on a couple different levels. On the one hand, it is clearly a letter from Paul to Timothy. There's going to be several moments throughout the text where Paul is speaking directly to Timothy himself, and he gives Timothy some important charges, some important commissions. Let's look at those, just because they're so beautiful and important. So let's go back to First Timothy, please, and let's look at a couple of these charges that Paul commissions Timothy with. You probably recognize this. He says, "Wage the good warfare, Timothy. This is what I charge you, what's been entrusted to you." And then down, let's go to chapter 6, where Paul says, "As for you, man of God," Timothy's a man of God, "fight the good fight of faith," he says. And then in the last couple of verses, "Oh, Timothy, guard the deposit which was entrusted to you." Powerful moments. So that's one level on which this letter is operating. However, if you read the letter carefully, you can tell that Paul intended for this letter to be read to the entire church in Ephesus. And that's why he opens the letter the way that he does. Let's look at the first verse of 1 Timothy. Look at this. Let's go back up to chapter 1. Paul says, "Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus," to Timothy. Now, Paul usually only emphasizes his apostolic authority when he's talking to churches he doesn't like Galatians. Man, Galatians, they were terrible. All this horrible stuff's going on there. So he says, "I'm an apostle. You should listen to the content I have inside of my letter." But when he's writing to, Thessalonica, that's persecuted, a young church, or when he's writing to the church in Philippi, who are just his best buds, he doesn't emphasize his apostolic authority. Why would he emphasize it here when he's writing to Timothy, who was his partner in the ministry for years? He doesn't need to emphasize his authority unless he intends for the church in Ephesus to hear this letter and to say, "I am Paul the apostle, and I'm investing all of my authority as an apostle to Timothy, my true child in the faith. Therefore, I want you, Ephesians, I want you to listen to Timothy. Even though he's young, I've invested my authority in him." I like that. It's powerful to see the relationship between Paul and Timothy there. But let's go back to see to that most important verse of 1 Timothy, which kind of sets it all up. Chapter 1, verse 3. What does Paul tell Timothy to do? "Remain in Ephesus and charge certain persons not to teach any different doctrine." Now, who are these certain persons? Who are they, and where do they come from? Well, this brings up another unique element about 1 Timothy. In some of Paul's other letters where he's addressing false teachers like Galatians, Philippians, 2 Corinthians, all of those false teachers come from outside of the church in. They come from Judea, they're Judaizers, something like that. But that's not the case with 1 Timothy. With 1 Timothy, the false teachers that we're dealing with, they are most likely elders within the church of Ephesus that have gone astray. And this is exactly what Paul said would happen in his sermon to the Ephesian elders in Miletus. Remember, we talked about that a minute ago? He said, "Fierce wolves are going to come from among you and deceive the flock." Let's look at that speech in Acts 20. Acts 20. Here we are. So Paul's speaking to the Ephesian elders, and he says in verse 28, "Pay attention to yourselves and to the flock. Know that after my departure," because he knows he's going to go to Jerusalem, maybe he's going to be arrested, "after my departure, fierce wolves will come in among you. They won't spare the flock. And from among your own selves, there will arise men who will speak twisted things and draw many disciples away after them." So the bad guys in 1 Timothy are elders who have gone astray. And Paul's going to identify two of these elders by name, Hymenaeus and Alexander. And he says, "Man, I've excommunicated them. I have kicked them out of the church. Well, let's look at that moment in 1 Timothy. Jumping to the scriptures. It's always good to spend a lot of time in the scriptures, kind of to demonstrate what we're teaching. Among whom are Hymenaeus and Alexander. And Paul says, I have handed them over to Satan that they may not learn to blaspheme. I've excommunicated them out of the church. So what are these guys and some of the other elders or people within the church, what are they teaching? What is their false teaching? Well, I would like to, in this lecture, briefly introduce 4 points which kind of set up what the teaching is, what its ramifications were, and how Timothy was to respond to it. So 4 points. First, I called it exclusivism. These false teachers claimed to teach an advanced form of Christianity with special wisdom and special knowledge, which only the elite could understand. So in this sense, their teaching, their false teaching, was very exclusive. Either you're part of the club and you're super wise, or you're just some average Joe Christian. So that's element number 1. Element number 2, it seems likely, based on a few different things, that these elders were charging money for their advanced teaching. They had a love of money. Point number 2. Point number 3, it seems like there were some women in the church who fell for it, who fell for their false teaching, and were now following these false teachers. So there are some deceived women, among whom are some young widows, we think. And then point number 4, Paul is going to call Timothy to strip these elders of their position and replace them with new elders. So that's point number 4. Let's turn our attention now. Let's kind of address a new subject, the structure of this letter. What is the structure of 1 Timothy? Well, it reflects the fact that it is a letter from Paul to Timothy, in that it has 3 large blocks which are just words from Paul to Timothy. So chapters 1, 4, and 6. I have them kind of in purple as the title. These are charges from Paul to Timothy. It includes the wage the good warfare, fight the good fight, guard the deposit. 1, 4, and 6. But what's unique, and it took me a little while to figure this out, is I'm reading the book really closely. What's unique about these chapters is that every time that Paul is going to charge Timothy to do something, whatever that is, every time he charges him to do something, right next to it, he's going to describe the false teachers. So there's going to be a charge to Timothy, description of false teachers. Charge to Timothy, description of false teachers. Charge to Timothy, description of false teachers. Every time in these chapters. Let me demonstrate it, because I think it's really interesting, and it definitely shows how Paul is carefully crafting this letter. So let's let me show you what I mean. So here we have, this is that charge to Timothy, and then a description of the false teachers. And then we have again a charge to Timothy, description of false teachers. So that's chapter 1. Let's look at chapter 4. So here we have a charge to Timothy, and then description of false teachers. Charge to Timothy, description of false teachers. And then also in chapter 6, charge to Timothy, teach and urge these things. And then a description of the false teachers. We're almost done here. Charge to Timothy, that this is a longer charge, and then description of the false teachers. And finally, charge to Timothy, guard the good deposit, and then a description of those false teachers and their irreverent babble. So there you go. Isn't that kind of interesting how those things are just lined up like that so precisely? Well, in between these charges to Timothy are instructions for specific groups within the church in Ephesus, specific groups of people. So in chapters 2 and 3, Paul's going to have instructions for men and women, instructions for elders and deacons. And then in it's effectively chapter 5, Paul is going to have instructions for older men and women, younger men and women, including widows. That would, of course, only be women. And then instructions for elders and for slaves. And we'll see how these instructions kind of fit in with the main issue of the book of 1 Timothy, which is the false teaching. We'll see how that works next. And then finally, the final element of the structure of 1 Timothy is three doxologies, three beautiful doxologies, which Paul weaves into this personal and pointed letter of 1 Timothy. And we're going to admire the beauty of these doxologies, and we're going to study a little bit more closely each of these 4 points concerning the false teaching in our next lecture.